what they call the voice of God telling them what to do. Now, God does not have a voice like that. And so, if you're hearing a voice telling you what to do, it is definitely not God. And in fact, if you listen to many of the things that happen on earth, like many of the people who murder, for example, will tell you that they actually had a voice telling them, that some of them have interpreted as God's voice, telling them that they should murder a person. And it's obviously not God's voice. It's obviously somebody else telling them what to do. I had my friend, the Apostle John, died in this life because he had a friend of his felt he was told by God to murder him. And it was just a spirit in a very dark location telling the man to murder John. Yeah. So it's unfortunately, a lot of these concepts get modified so much that we finish up abdicating our own will. And this is something these two people, the guides and the guardians, will never support you doing. They will never support you abdicating your own will. They won't help you do it. Right? Does that make sense to everyone? They will not help you abdicate your will. They will not help you give up responsibility for your life. They want you to take full responsibility for your life. Totally the opposite. Yeah?
Could you just answer the first question about the nature of the nature of God's relationship?
Yeah. You understand the perspective that God is an entity.
Yes. The question is that the entity?
The entity that created all other entities, if you like.
Yeah.
And inclusive of creation, not only created all other entities, but created all other universes for which those entities would live in.
Otherwise couldn't be God.
Yeah, exactly. So that's God, the entity. Now, the entity God is so, in my personal experience, is so uniquely powerful that the best way I could liken her to is like a supercomputer on Earth, if I can give you an analogy. Now, a supercomputer on Earth has the ability to serve at the speed that every person can handle it, to serve hundreds of thousands of people at the same time. Right? This is what man has created. Man has created computers which have the ability to actually give information to people faster than the people can actually process that information. Does that make sense? Now, man, therefore, has created a device that has this ability to share information with large numbers of people without there being a limitation on the receiving end. In other words, the people on the receiving end have a difficulty even keeping up with the information they're receiving. Now, if you can replace that as an idea or concept, that God has the ability to emotionally, through emotions, and primary emotion, of course, is love, to emotionally connect with every single entity that she has created. Every single entity. Then you start to get a conception of the power of God, I suppose you could say. But secondly, and perhaps I feel more importantly, God knows every single entity personally, and it knows their entire life. As I said in the first century, knows the number of hairs on your head and every single other thing about your life. God knows already. So because of this connection God has with every single entity that God has created. What is always amazing to me, still, is that God wants to enter a personal interaction with every one of those entities. That to me is one of the most fascinating and thrilling things that you could possibly conceive. And I discovered that in the first century, but I am still overwhelmed every time I think about it. How much God can actually have this personal love for every single one of the entities that God herself has created. And that was the thing that I found so difficult to even teach in the first century. Because until you have some kind of concept of how grand God is, and then have some kind of concept of how personal God is at the same time, you can't sort of grasp the incredible beauty of that possibility, of that relationship. And so what I feel is missing on the planet now is that because we have begun to assume that the entity, God, is her creations. In other words, we have begun to assume that the universe is God. In other words, we have begun to assume that God does not have personality and that God does not have attributes and characteristics that are personal. We have begun to assume that God's like a power supply, like a nuclear power facility, if you like. That's what we've begun to assume. And this is what I feel is a terrible assumption about God, because it reduces God to an energy rather than a personality. And it also reduces my relationship with God now to a relationship with with energy, which is very impersonal and very difficult for us as humans even to conceive in terms of how can a person with, it's just an energy source, love me. Now, if we understand that God is an entity, which is the basis of what I've taught for 2,000 years, we begin to understand that God has this personal, even though God is immensely powerful, far more powerful than we can ever imagine. In fact, I've spent 2,000 years looking at God's laws, just the framework. I see the laws as a framework of what God has created, right? Because the laws create further potentials. Like some of the things that we've yet to create ourselves personally, universally, God has already created the potential for us to be able to create before we've even done it. And this is an amazing fact about God. But even though all of this beautiful framework exists, God still has a personal interest in me. God still has a desire to know me and me to know her. And God doesn't force that knowledge either direction on me, but God waits for me to engage the possibility of that relationship. And I just think that's an amazing fact about God. And that's, I feel, if you can only grasp that about God, about God's desire to know you and to give you love and for you to experience her love, then most people would automatically start to consider more about God, I feel. But when we start looking at God as an energy, it detunes us from this personal relationship.
No, that's absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm here, because you're one of the few people I've heard speak about that relationship, which I feel very intuitively. I've had moments of mind-blowing
clarity on,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, most people on the planet at times in their life do have moments of clarity that God is an entity and I'm able to have this personal relationship. But the problem is we have so much misinformation on the planet that we then go into doubt because we hear this other information, and then after a while the ability for us to have this relationship then gets clouded by the false information that we're presented with. Whereas the entity God, who loves us deeply but also has this immense power at the same time and therefore has the ability to completely interact with every individual entity she has created. And in fact, she would never have created any entity that she was not able to have a personal relationship with, if you think about what love would do. So it's a bit like you as a parent, if you really love your children, you would not create more children than you can love. Right? And that's the same with God. God hasn't created more children than she can love. And when you understand that about God, then you can start to have some really strong emotions with God that can bring you this love and this relationship that you'll find continually overwhelm you through the rest of your life and existence, which is what I find all the time. Like I'm always overwhelmed by God, basically. Yeah.
Going back to prayer, then.
Yes.
If God knows every single hair on the head,
yes,
he would understand whether we're being sincere or not.
Exactly.
And then she would also understand that we have our limitations and that we're possibly either spiritually intruded or
Yes.
whatever. So, although going back to what Judith said earlier, if there is a sincerity inside,
Yes.
then he will recognise that, and the prayer could then be pure and sincere.
Exactly. God automatically understands when we have sincere, pure desires, because God feels us at every moment. So the instant we have an emotion, a feeling, in fact, towards God that is pure, God's already responding to it. God already knew, in fact, that we would have that at that particular moment, and is already responding. And it's amazing when you live in the spirit world, seeing how a lot of things in the spirit world, particularly with regards to guardians and guides, happen because of the longing of a person that they've not had yet on the earth. In the sense that God even knows they're going to have the longing and has the guide or guardian ready for the person, ready for them to have the longing at the right time. That's how incredibly in tune God is with all of her creations. So it's a beautiful thing. But can I just address one part of your question? Don't assume that you have limitations. You see, what often happens on earth is in the first century, I described this quite frequently as well. I'm going to write this word on the board. Most people don't like it. Sin, right? Now, in the first century, I described to people that sin was missing the mark of love. So in other words, every time we are not acting purely in love, we are sinning. We are missing the mark of love. Right? And that was the underlying Greek word that I used that allowed this description of sin. Now, we can sin accidentally or purposefully. Would you not agree? In other words, we could miss the mark of love only because we did not know what love was, or we can know what love was or know what the loving thing is and miss the mark of love. So in other words, sin has two possible connotations. One is a purposeful desire to miss the mark of love, to be unloving, and the other one is an unintentional impulse that caused us to miss the mark of love. Now, God has created for you these guides and guardians to help you with the unintentional impulses that you have and with the purposeful impulses that you have to miss the mark of love. God's created both, this arrangement to help you with both. But can you understand that when we're intentional, when we show intent to be unloving, can you agree with me that that demonstrates a worse condition in terms of a love than if we have an unintentional mistake? Can you see that? So if somebody... So in our culture, in our society, there's a few things you can do that might kill a person. Like you might be driving along in a car and something go wrong with your car, you go across the opposite side of the road, have a head-on accident with the car coming, and a person dies as a result of your actions of being in that place at that time. Now, in our society, we call that manslaughter. Basically, in Australian society, we call it that, and ours came from England, so I'm assuming you call that the same here. That is an unintentional thing that occurred on your behalf that created the death of another. Now, can you agree that that is very different than murder, where you have an intentional desire to harm another person and you decide to act upon that desire?
But is it even a sin?
Sorry?
Is it a sin?
Remember my definition of sin? So the question was, is it a sin? My definition of sin was any time you missed the mark of love, right? Whether it's unintentional or intentional. However, what I'm saying is, if it's intentional, then it would be a greater sin than if it was unintentional. Does that make sense to everyone? Right? So what I'm saying is, if we have an intent to miss the mark of love, we have an intent to do something that's unloving, then that shows a greater amount of unloving feelings inside of ourselves than if we have no intent, but it happens mistakenly through an action that we've taken. Can I point out, however, that God wants us to, and we have the ability to, eradicate all desire to sin. And what I meant by that in the first century was we have the ability within ourselves to eradicate, and in fact when we receive God's love to one-ment, at the point of one-ment, we will have eradicated all desire to do anything unloving. So by the time we reach at one-ment with God, we can actually be in a condition where we're no longer desiring to do anything unloving in our entire life. We still have free will to do anything we want, but we choose, because of this intent, we choose to never do anything that's unloving, automatically. And that condition is the condition of at-one-ment with God. Just hang a sec. Can you wait for me? Because there's a lady next to you who's had her hand up for some time and I want to ask her.
I was getting confused, finding it hard to understand how, if you fully knew God, then why you would have a desire, an intention to do something that wasn't in love. And then I got more confused when you were just saying, were you saying that you can fully know God but not be in at-one-ment with him?
No, to fully know God, you would have to be at some point in at-one-ment with God, yes? And if you were at one with God, then you would never have an intention to sin, ever. And in fact, when you're at one with God, you never even mistakenly sin. Right? Now, mistaken sin, or sin that an action that is taken by mistake that is unloving, always comes from underlying emotions that we're needing to heal. Right? But the difference between these two sets of emotions are, these are very much more severe. If I have a desire to hurt you, that is very, very different than me accidentally hurting you. Does that make sense? So if I have a desire to go up to Joy and punch her in the arm, and I choose to follow the desire, then that's very, very different than me accidentally swinging my hand around while I was talking and then all of a sudden I hit Joy. Is it?
I thought I heard you say that you could know God but still make the choice to do something that hurts.
No, I'm saying that people on earth think they know God,
okay,
but often make a choice that's unloving. How many people who feel they have a relationship with God are willing to go to war, for example?
Yeah, many.
Well, that tells me that every one of those people who think they have a relationship with God that have gone to war don't have one with God.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, I heard you wrong.
Yeah. Yep.
Ada, sorry, it just that you said this when I mentioned limitation, you went, whoa, I want to bring up limitation.
Yep.
So are we talking about sin being limitation?
Every time we act unlovingly,
Yeah. So,
or sinning, we are automatically in a space of limitation. But it is of our own choice.
yeah.
Right? Now, what I'm saying is there's two types of sin. We have often the intent to sin, or we have just a drawing or a desire that leads us to sin, or a desire that leads us to do something that's unloving. Now, in either case, if we are sincere and pure in our heart, we would want to know why. So if I was driving along the road and I accidentally went across the other side of the road through some action, it might have been I was looking down trying to play with the stereo or something on the car and I'm across the other side, have a head-on with the person, then I would need to look at what caused me to, in that moment, be so distracted that when I'm driving a 2-ton vehicle that potentially can harm another person, that could cause me to be distracted. Now, if I sincerely have a desire to do that, I will actually find the emotion inside of me, the unloving intent inside of me that caused me. And it might have been just selfishness, like I'm annoyed with that channel, so I choose it to another channel, and then that moment, before I know it, something's happened. So I would work through that, right? But that's very, very different than having an intent to hurt somebody, an intent to ram your car into the other person coming in the other direction. Obviously, there's even darker emotions there that would drive such intent. And what I'm saying is that we need to be very careful that we do not say to ourselves, oh, it was just a mistake. When the reality is every mistake we make comes from some kind of unhealed emotion. In the spirit world, in the celestial kingdom, in the kingdom of God that I talked about in the first century, nobody in that world actually makes a mistake, because they're at one with God, and God doesn't make mistakes. And nobody in that world makes mistakes. They all have their different desires that go in all different directions, but nobody actually makes a mistake that harms another person. So once we become at one with God, we will be the same. We will not make mistakes that harm other people, ever. Whether it was, and we certainly would never do it with intent, right, once we're at one with God. But we need to be very careful before we're in that condition. We need to be very careful that we don't justify sin. In other words, we don't say to ourselves, well, I'm not perfect. That's why that happened. See, I'd call that a justification of the unloving behaviour. And that is not a loving thing to do, to ever justify an unloving act. So we need to be very careful that we do not justify our unloving behaviour, but rather we would sincerely want to address it. Now, if we sincerely want to address it, then that is a prayer, automatically. Prayer, as soon as we sincerely have a feeling directed towards God, it's a prayer. Instantly, God responds to such prayers. In fact, the reality is that God often is already responding before we even finish the prayer. Right? That is very, very different than me still wanting to hold on to my addiction and then praying. So in other words, not wanting to address the unintentional or intentional way that I've not been loving. So a person who's truly sincere wants to address all the reasons why they're unloving inside of themselves. A person who is truly sincere. A person who is not sincere wants to believe they're being loving when they're not. Wants to believe they're being kind when they're not. Wants to believe they're being compassionate when they're not. And a person in that case, praying or longing for God to assist them in the act, would find that such a prayer is not going to reach very much higher than their own unloving intention. Just hang a sec for the mic to come down. I just want to put that.
In the prayer for divine truth, you say we are not the sinful, depraved creatures that others have made us believe. Mm-hmm. Do you mean that we do have sin, but if we go into it with inquiry and compassion and sincerity, then that's not, causing the same persecution or making us feel about it in the same way?
Yes, so in the prayer I said we are not the sinful, depraved people. The problem with what religion generally has done with my words in the first century is that they have taken my attitude towards sin, which is any time that I'm unloving, I've sinned, and then they've turned it into being something that each of us is, and we cannot change it. So what they've done is they've turned it into being a permanent state. They actually, in fact, many religions have turned it so much permanent that they actually believe we were created sinful. They actually believe that it's impossible for us to not be sinful. And this is a very big error that I feel mankind is in. This belief that we intrinsically are bad and there's nothing we can do about it is one of the worst possible beliefs, because it firstly says that there's no free will, and secondly, it also suggests that we shouldn't have to take responsibility for our condition. If God created us sinful before we began, then how can we ever become anything other than sinful? Right? The reality is that we are not the sinful, depraved creatures that religions teach us. In other words, inbuilt inside of us, there is the capacity to sin, in the sense that we are given free will, and so therefore we have the capacity to use that will unlovingly. Therefore, the capacity, under the definitions that I've given, the capacity to sin. But we are not intrinsically, as an entity, bad. We are not created intrinsically as a sinful, depraved person. It is actions that we take based on different emotions that we've collected from our environment that cause us to take those actions, that cause us to become more sinful or more out of harmony with love. But even for the person, there are many spirits here with us, and even the person who is the most darkest person who's here present with us tonight is not designed to be sinful and depraved. Does that make sense? And that's what I meant by those words in the prayer. So what I meant by the words in the prayer is stop believing that you are intrinsically bad and start understanding that any choice that we have to sin or any choice that we have to miss the mark of love is a choice that we can change. And when we change it, we have the ability to create a totally different person and life as a result of those changes. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, on that subject, do we then automatically absorb the sins of our parents in conception? As in, the emotions where our parents missed the mark, we also then absorb those same emotions, so then we have that emotion within us.
Yes.
At conception, yeah.
If you understand, so if we just go back to the definition of sin, because I want to make sure that everyone gets the definition of sin rather than the religious definition of sin. So sin is equal to not being loving. Right, that's all it is. Now, if that's the definition of sin, then every time our parents aren't loving, even if it's before we're born, if our parents aren't loving, there is something inside of them that causes them to not be loving. There is an emotion or a feeling or a belief or something inside of them, inside of what I would classify as their soul, right, which causes them to be unloving. Now, if I am in the condition where I am born by two parents, so I have mum and dad, and there's baby me, anything, any attitude, belief, feeling, emotion that is in them cannot but enter me. It has to enter me. Just by association. I'm there, I'm present, and of course I'm going to absorb it. God made our soul with the ability to absorb everything in our environment. And so it's going to absorb the emotions of the parents. Now, this is a very, very powerful thing that God's given us to teach us about love. Because when we as parents see our child reflect our own unloving condition, we now can go, whoa, that's in me. I need to address this. If a person cannot see their own unloving condition reflected in their child, then when will they ever see it? Can you see it? Like, if you cannot love your own child, and your child reflects the fact that they're not purely loved in their actions, then when am I ever going to see that I'm being unloving? Our children are a beautiful, beautiful reflection, and in fact it's something that God has created as our potential, is to have children so that they can reflect to us where we're being out of harmony with love. Now, in that way, every single parent who have a child automatically pass down, if they refuse to eradicate their own sin, in other words, they refuse to address the areas inside of themselves that are unloving, then they are undoubtedly going to pass those particular errors down to their child just by association. You're living in an environment where everything's unloving, you automatically have a tendency to become the same kind of person. And in that way, I said in the first century, the sins of the father gets passed down to the son, to generations, because it's getting the unloving attitudes and unloving beliefs that are in the parents, if the parents do not address them, will be passed down to the child.
I have a 12-year-old that's absolutely telling that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the beauty of having children, is that they can reflect at us what's going on for us. And the beauty of the child in that regard is that they're actually showing us where we're not yet harmonious with love. See, God has put into place a lot of systems to assist us. So God doesn't just sort of leave us all hanging. See, there's a belief on earth that God does, but the reality is God doesn't leave us all hanging. In fact, the guardian and the guide are two proofs that God does not leave us hanging. God gives us assistance and direction to become more loving. But God has also provided other things. You've heard of the law of attraction. Many of you heard of that, yes? Yep. The law of attraction is another loving provision of God to show us when we're being unloving. Because we will attract the events into our lives that expose the unloving condition. We'll also attract beautiful events in our life that expose the beautiful condition. We'll attract both kind of events because that's the way our soul was created. But also children are a great way to help us, because the provision of children is such that our children reflect our own unloving condition. And so we can look at ourselves and we can examine ourselves whenever our children are out of harmony with love. By the way, there are so many other things that were created as well. There's pets that we finish up having, animals that we finish up having as close to us. They also reflect our own unloving condition. There are so many things that God has created to give us assistance, to show us when we're actually not in harmony with love. Now, God's not trying to say, you've got to be in harmony with love, otherwise I'm going to punish you and all those kind of things. No, in the first century I said to people, look, God doesn't withhold the rain from you, and God doesn't withhold food from you. God doesn't withhold any of these beautiful things from you, and God doesn't even withhold it from the most wicked of persons. However, God is always trying to give us help to become more loving. He's trying to give the wicked person as much help as he's trying to give the person who's less wicked. He wants to help all of us to become more loving. And even God tries to help us become more loving even if we don't want God. So in other words, God's trying to help us become more loving on the planet even if we choose to not have a relationship with God. Does that make sense? So it's a beautiful system that God's created in order to help us. But mankind is very intent a lot of the times in going in the opposite direction, away from love, away from humility, away from owning their own feelings and emotions. And as a result of that, mankind finishes up creating a lot of suffering, which many of us have personally experienced.